The wind at the bottom of the world does not howl. It grinds, like teeth in a sleeping jaw, while the ice beneath spreads its weight across centuries. They came for routine measurements, the kind that stack neatly into quiet papers and tidy careers. The first hint arrived as a low tremor that instruments translated into a note scarcely audible, a patient thrum living somewhere between heartbeat and tide. It should have been noise, yet it repeated, precise as a metronome, steady as breath. The drill descended, steam meeting ancient cold, and a camera followed into blue darkness. Years of snow compressed into a cathedral of light, a vaulted corridor leading nowhere human. Then the signal changed. It matched their drilling rhythm, then anticipated it by a fraction. That was the moment unease hardened into fear. Not because something moved, because something listened. Under 2 miles of ice, the continent answered their knock. Morning came pale and grainy, as if the sun had traveled too far to remember this place. They argued softly over oatmeal and silence, each carrying private reasons to keep drilling and public reasons to stop. The instruments offered no comfort. The signal did not fade with daylight. It clarified, separating into a primary pulse and a murmur that braided around it like a second voice. 2 radios picked up the beat independently. The generator registered microscopic voltage swings that lined up with it. Nothing natural repeats so politely across devices, not meant to talk. They tried to jam it with white noise and the pulse stepped aside, then slid back in, like a practiced dancer, giving them room to fall. By noon, the camp seemed smaller. The white horizon pressed closer, the way walls feel when the lights go out. The simplest explanation, they told themselves, is always wrong at first. They prepared the camera for a second descent. This time, they wrapped the housing with a sleeve of microheaters and lined the tether with ferry chokes, a belt of charms against malevolent physics. The first drop had shown a cavern smooth as thought, a dark circle too clean for nature. The second began with a tremor felt in the wrists, a subtle syncopation that made hearts stumble to follow. 30 meters down, the feed rolled and steadied, blue walls curving like a throat. 50 meters, a fog of glitter rose from the floor, as if 1,000 tiny needles had been exhaled. At 70, the circle resolved into a ring, edges beveled with the immodest precision of design. A notch stood at its north, pointing nowhere in particular, and exactly somewhere at once. 80 meters, the heaters flickered. 90, the lights dimmed. At 100, a shadow crossed the lens from below, slow and deliberate, and every person watching forgot to breathe. They did not say the word door. They said ring, aperture, feature, artifact by appearance only. Outside, wind redrew the camp in pale streaks, while the pulse shifted, trading its steady patience for a curious lilt. In the lab tent, a different rhythm rose. Paper turned, gloves creaked, pencils clicked. An entry from the old expedition mentioned a circle and a hum like distant surf. Then a note about weather that did not match recorded conditions that week. The mismatch cut cleanly. Either the journals lied or time itself had learned to bend around whatever lay beneath. One map traced a buried channel leading to the site. On its margin, a hand had inked a shape with 11 sides and called it an approximation. 11, they said aloud, as if the number might settle the air. The pulse answered with 11 quick beats. Every light in the tent lowered, not dimming, but bowing. Evening tightened like a belt. The storm forecast curled toward them from the south, a river of cloud dragging ground winds in its wake. They made the choice without voting. There are decisions that arrive already wearing your fingerprints. The descent gear took shape in swift, economical movements. A winch line doubled, a heated cage for the camera, a harness for a human who might have to go where the machine could not. No one said first or volunteer or brave. They checked knots with the solemnity of ritual. The pulse relaxed again, settling into the slow count they had learned to hear in their ribs. If it was a language, it had just given permission. If it was an animal, it had just fallen asleep. If it was a door, it had just opened its ear to the hinge. The borehole rim glowed, a small sun melting its own horizon, and the night closed around them like a witness. Snow rattled against the tent like rice in a tin while paper breathed, and old ink woke up under warm hands. The journals did not confess easily. Pages stuck where water had once frozen and thawed in a ship's hold. Sentences broke off mid-thought. Dates drifted like flows. Yet a line resurfaced again and again, written by different hands that never met. It spoke of a circle that was not stone, of a hum that patterned sleep, of a sky that rippled without wind. In the margins were sketches of a coastline that did not match any current map, a memory pulled from beneath the ice, as if the continent itself were dictating. Between entries a silence yawned wide, weeks without marks, then a final spatter of coordinates scrawled in a hurry. No names remained at the end, only a penciled apology to whoever followed. The apology felt fresh, as if it had been written to the room and the hour, and the people holding the paper now. The resupply flight arrived as a shimmer on the horizon, a dragonfly drawn in contrails. Then the air thickened with a tone that turned the ribs into tuning forks. The pilot's greeting came chopped and distant, not by storm or static, but by something breathing between syllables. Instruments on the mast answered with a slow nod, frequencies bending as if the wind had become glass. In the thin light, the aircraft circled once, twice, then climbed against orders, reporting yaw fluctuations that did not register on the mechanical logs. A handheld recorder captured a ghost beat under the engine note, a patient countermeasure to human noise. When the skids finally kissed the snow, the sensation lifted, as if the continent had sniffed the visitor and set it down again with careful disdain. Inside the cockpit, the gauges were normal, the fuel slightly lower than expected, and everyone's hands shook even after the heat came back through the vents. They returned to the borehole with a superstition they did not call by name. The drill steel had learned to register the day before, a careful hum that kept its teeth safe. Today the gauges rose as if friction had doubled. Though ice should relent under hot water and patience, the line sang a higher note, and the heater arrays drew current, as if the shaft walls were absorbing heat without rising in temperature. Down the column, a second pressure reading wobbled, a mirage inside the numbers. The shaft camera skated along a narrowed throat, glazed to a polish that recorded its own reflection, a corridor smoothed by something more deliberate than melt. At 90 meters, the torque eased as if entering a room. Then the cable slackened in a way no winch operator likes, a telltale sag that suggested open space below. The pulse climbed half an octave and fell back, the way a held breath sometimes escapes before it is meant to. In the supply crate lay a metal canister nobody had requested, a relic wrapped in oilcloth and bureaucratic indifference. Inside, film waited like a thin sleeping animal. The tent became a cinema. A white sheet trembled gently, and the projector ticked its metered appetite for light. Grain spilled a world in monochrome where faces squinted at horizons that have since shifted. The camera panned across a blue tunnel iridescent as a mussel shell, then steadied on an arc too confident to belong to geology. Frost clung to its edge in feathers, not crystals, as if grown on breath. A gloved hand extended into frame, touch hovering without courage. Then the picture jumped and returned with the frame subtly skewed. The arc now, a segment of a perfect circle no lens distortion could invent. A sound trackless films are not supposed to have crept into the tent. A gentle counting that didn't stop when the projector did. Morning broke with air so clear it felt sharpened. They pushed farther from camp across snow that had forgotten every footprint by lunch. The compasses behaved until a ridge reared up from the white, like the spine of a sleeping creature. Iron stained the snow in freckles where wind had gnawed through, and the handheld magnetometer sulked, then spiked, then refused to settle. Beneath the ridge, the signal softened to a purr that traveled through boots rather than ears, a sensation that lifted hair along forearms and set teeth on edge. A buried seam announced itself with a tidy linear depression too straight for wind and too patient for a machine. Left long ago. When they walked parallel to it, their shadows bent in a way the sun could not explain. On a map, the ridge cast a shadow of its own, a ghost geometry laid over their route. They marked it with flags that trembled even when the air was still. The shaft narrowed into a throat of blue glass, and the camp above receded to a memory held by rope and radio. Heat licked the walls where steam met cold, turning ancient ice to ghost rain that glittered in the headlamp glow. The pulse descended with them, no longer distant but intimate. A measured presence that settled in the bones and counted. At 30 meters, the air changed from sterile to mineral, a faint tang like water locked before language. At 60, the rope lost the crisp scrape of ice and slid as if over polished stone. Then the column opened with a hush that felt like etiquette, as if something below preferred quiet arrivals. The first breath from the vault rose warmer than expected and carried a fragrance no one could name. A trace of metal and salt and something floral that never knew sunlight. The lamp beams spread and were swallowed, not by darkness but by space so large it made thought echo. Boots touched an island of floor in an ocean of shadow, and light revealed a geometry that argued with geology. The surface underfoot held the sheen of worked metal, but beneath a thin glaze the grain was not any alloy, not any stone. Something that took polish like water remembers a shore. Curves met at angles too precise for glacial patience, as if a mind had traced a compass inside the earth and told the ice to keep its hands off. Their voices defaulted to hush, not from fear, but from respect for proportions that made noon feel like night in a cathedral. The pulse arrived from everywhere at once, and nowhere in particular, traveling through fabric, gear, hair, and teeth with the tenderness of a lullaby offered by a stranger. The instruments agreed only on what they could not classify. Numbers held their breath, and names wandered. And in the wandering a new habit formed. They listened before they moved. They tested the simplest language they knew. A slow clap, palm to palm, steady and kind. The vault answered with a rise in pressure too delicate for ears, but plain to ribs. A measured tap on the dais with a rubber mallet produced a chord that rang without sound. A sensation like a hand resting on the sternum. Someone counted out loud and the pulse followed, then led by a breath's fraction. Playful or precise, impossible to tell. The metronome app was useless here. The room had its own clock. Beyond the dais, the dark held a ring that memory insisted was a perfect circle, though no one had yet seen all of it at once. Air moved without draft, a traveling wave that erased footprints and smoothed disturbed dust with gentle patience. There was no sense of threat, only the uncanny courtesy of being noticed, and that courtesy frightened more than any rumor of teeth. Cold bloomed as flowers on the dais without warning. Petals of hoarfrost unfurled from nothing, lacy and delicate as breath crystal, then vanished as if swallowed by a sigh. They came in waves that matched the count. 11 blooms, a pause, 11 more. Each petal riddled with microgeometry that should have taken hours, but lived only seconds. The phenomenon tore at the mind with its elegance. Frost is supposed to obey the tyranny of thermodynamics, not choreography. A gloved palm hovered above a forming rosette and felt no chill, only a hum like a friendly transformer. Cameras caught patterns within patterns, spirals nested in hexagons that shifted too quickly to live on paper. The vault seemed to be showing them something in a language built from temperature and time. For a moment, the terror melted into gratitude, the way a child feels when a giant kneels to speak softly at eye level. Then the petals collapsed, and the count changed. Silence followed the last rosette, a silence that was not absence, but attention. The circle at the edge of vision admitted its shape, a ring half-buried, beveled like a coin, meant for hands larger than human. No seam showed, Yet something yielded. A gap formed that was not a gap. A deepening of dark like water, deciding to be river. The pulse lowered, slower than rest now, as if asking for company or asking for care. Ice above creaked in a tone that did not spell danger, but did spell change. Light reached only a little way into the opening and came back softened. Tinged with a color the mind insisted was a memory rather than hue. They did not say door, not even then. They spoke of a threshold, of a hinge expressed as geometry, of a choice that would engrave itself on the rest of their days. The opening widened by the width of a breath and waited. Light grazed the inner curve and revealed marks that were not scratches and not ornament. Lines crossed in patient lattices, shallow as breath on glass, yet immune to the gouge of a knife. The pattern did not choose a human north. It oriented itself to a sky none of them had lived beneath. A vault where familiar constellations sat skewed and youthful, the way faces look in childhood photographs. A hand traced one arc and felt an almost musical resistance, as if the surface preferred certain paths and discouraged others with the gentleness of a teacher. Numbers tried to colonize the site and failed. The spacing whispered ratios older than the alphabets pinned to laboratory walls. Between the lines were dots not cut but grown, each a lens that gathered their lamps and returned a cooler echo. Someone whispered that it was a map. The word felt too small, like calling an ocean a puddle. If it was a map, its memory reached farther than any library, and it had chosen to live where ice could keep it from clumsy questions. Samples traveled from edge to case with a ceremony once reserved for relics. A sliver the size of a fingernail sat under a pocket microscope and refused to behave. Grain boundaries were missing where they should have marched. Stacking sequences misaligned in ways that would have produced brittle failure in any known alloy. Yet, the shard flexed between tweezers and recovered as if memory were part of its lattice. Spectroscopy sang a chorus without a soloist, peaks where no element should anchor, valleys where iron and nickel ought to shout. A meteor could be exotic but not inconsistent with the universe's habits. This was consistent only with itself. A torch touched one corner and the heat slid off like rain on oiled stone, the surface temperature rising and falling with the rhythm underfoot rather than with flame. A magnet loved it from a distance and ignored it up close. Words shuffled and found none that sat without wobble. The shard seemed less a thing than a behavior made visible. Conversation began without vocabulary. A tap, a pause, a pair of taps, the simplest grammar of intent. The room attended. Pressure drew closer to the skin, tiny hairs lifting along forearms, a tide against the shore of a human outline. They set a metronome to the old 11 and laid a new pattern across it, a polite invitation rather than a demand. The floor answered as a soft push against boot soles, a reply that landed before the second beat, eager or merely accurate. The exchange settled into a call and response that made time feel like a braided rope rather than a line. The curious part was not that the vault could follow. It was that it preferred certain phrases, rewarded them with a brightening of air, discouraged others by letting the lights dull a fraction. The realization tilted the room. Preference suggests mind, or something wearing mind like a winter coat. If agency lived here, it did not sharpen into threat. It simply asked them to learn. Pattern became picture. A string of beats grouped and spaced until it drew coordinates that did not need numbers, only distances between rests. Chalk laid the rhythm on the floor, and the shape that emerged was a coastline none of them had visited. An outline someone might know by smell and wind. Comparative charts lifted on a tablet confirmed a likeness to an equatorial bay. Then a correction arrived as the count shifted and the form pivoted a few degrees. The vault was not pointing. It was remembering through rhythm, adjusting for a world that had turned since it first learned the song. The realization tugged the mind toward warm water and green air, places far from rime and hoarfrost. The implication unsettled more deeply than the cold. Whatever kept time here also mapped seas very far away. and it updated its memory when the conversation asked politely. The room did not boast. It placed a finger on an atlas and waited for them to decide whether to follow. The ceiling announced itself like weather. A tone rolled through the stone that was not stone, and the ice above answered with a long, low, relenting. The sound of a heavy sleeper turning over. Powder sifted in lace and settled on shoulders. The pulse slowed to a pace that did not belong to machines or to anxious human hearts. A continental tempo laid across the room like a blanket. No panic rose. Instead, a sober calm, the knowledge that scale was now in the conversation. The anchor line to the shaft hummed and stilled. A hairline in the upper vault widened the width of a breath, then closed as if the structure had learned to flex. The room did not threaten collapse. It practiced it, the way a great animal tests a limb after long rest. Lights bent warmer, and the smell in the air shifted towards salt stone after rain. They felt very small, very temporary, and very clearly invited to either step forward or leave with care. By morning, the world above had drawn a white curtain. Wind braided spindrift into ropes and lashed the shaft mouth shut. A siege mounted by weather that recognized trespass when it smelled it. Down in the vault, they counted batteries, food, and the hours they could safely borrow from the heaters. Choices sorted themselves into piles. What to carry if the rope had to be abandoned? What to leave that might anger the room? What record would speak if no voices returned? The pulse softened until it felt almost domestic, a hearth rhythm that threatened to make sleep seductive. The map on the floor looked suddenly fragile, chalk lines too mortal for a place that remembered oceans. They wrapped samples in foam as if swaddling infants, copied notes twice, and spoke quietly over the clack of cases. No one proposed a hero's plan. They practiced a humbler art, preparing to retreat without erasing the fact that they had been here at all. The panel that hummed had beckoned all morning, a section of the ring where light behaved too politely, curving along its skin as if coached. Fatigue preys at caution, and the mind invents bargains when weather writes the schedule. One of them lingered, reading the faint shimmer like a page, tracking how brightness crept along filaments laid impossibly fine beneath the surface. The hum slid up, a cat's purr turning articulate, and breath fell into step with it. For a few heartbeats, the world simplified, shoulders unknotted, pain and old injuries grew light. Then balance switched off with the crispness of a flipped breaker. Knees folded, the body folded after. Eyes shone with the dazed gratitude of someone returned from a place where troubles have no nouns. When hands lifted the head, skin was cool and pulse slow but steady, and the voice that finally came back brought a sentence with no verbs. The feeling of being seen and set down gently. They had been learning a grammar, and fatigue mangles tongues. To draw the room closer, they tried the sequence that had brightened the air earlier, but the count slipped. A polite cadence clipped into impatience by the tick of dwindling heat. The reply came as a firm correction. A swell of pressure that smoothed clothing against skin and pressed boot soles, as if the floor preferred better posture. Someone knocked again with resolve where gentleness had been requested. The vault answered with a resonance that made teeth complain and lights step back a shade. Equipment cases thumped as if nudged by an invisible elbow. The rope to the shaft lifted and settled, a warning given without drama. Apology is a language older than exploration, so they offered it with open hands and silence, and the room relented, the pressure lowering to a careful neutral. Still, the mistake left a bruise. Confidence shrank, and the door in the mind narrowed. Cold arrived not as temperature but as texture. A veil poured from the gap like silk that disliked being touched, layering the room until edges softened and motion smeared. Breath crystallized into needles that did not sting. Time loosened. Voices stretched like ribbon pulled slowly. Syllables arriving with the lazy grace of kelp in a tide. Watches agreed and then disagreed, seconds pooling and sprinting in skids. In the mist, the ring threw ghost images of hands and faces that lagged behind their owners by the measure of a sigh. Footsteps printed, unprinted, and printed again in slightly different places. In the center, the pulse became a lantern behind frosted glass, present and distant at once. They gathered close without conferring, shoulders nearly touching, forming a small island of warmth that kept thought from drifting. The room did not threaten. It learned them, or allowed them to learn how it breathed when pressure and time refused to obey. As quickly as it had learned to flex, the room decided to rest. The mist thinned, not by drifting away, but by deciding to be air again. The pulse that had become furniture in their bodies stepped back into the walls, into the floor, into whatever carried it here in the first place. Ears rang in the new absence. Small sounds returned in shy procession. A zipper tooth, a boot scuff, a swallow. The chalk map on the days looked deserted, like a shoreline after a tide pulls back farther than tides should. They waited for the next beat, and it did not arrive. The silence was not empty. It was full of expectation denied. They packed without hurry, not out of defeat, but because the moment demanded hands. Above, the storm would still be writing. Below, a door had closed without a fence. They looked at one another with the relief and grief reserved for endings that do not explain themselves. The storm relented, and the world resumed its habit of watching. Images came down from polar orbits in neat strips of light, clean as hospital sheets. Across the shelf, hairline fractures had walked through the ice in overnight silence. Not random, not wind-written, but marching in families that traced curves no glacier would choose. Overlays laid old shorelines where forests once exhaled and found the new cracks obedient to those ghosts, as if the continent remembered a younger skin and stretched to fit it. Numbers stacked into columns that looked like grace notes beside a melody. None of them could hum. The pattern refused to be weather. It behaved like intention expressed in geology. Radios chirped with voices that did not belong to the camp. A plane's contrail stitched the horizon, and a second orbiting eye shifted to a narrower lens. Whatever had breathed beneath them had exhaled into the map, and now the map itself had begun to answer back. The samples that rode up in padded cases behaved like polite saboteurs. Under cold benches, they yielded data that argued with textbooks, stacking atoms in sequences that should fail but did not. Lattices slid across themselves without dislocation, like book pages turning while the words stayed aligned. Heat did not climb in smooth curves, but stepped, waiting between plateaus as if for permission. In magnetic fields, they approached like shy birds, hovered and declined to land. A microscope set to image crystalline order discovered arrangements that looked grown rather than forged. Veins of geometry nested inside one another with the patience of coral. Each test promised a conclusion and delivered a riddle. The temptation was to name it an alloy and move on. The honest response was simpler and more dangerous: to admit that this was a behavior with the dignity of an organism, expressed in matter that refused to pick a category. The room above was quiet. The samples spoke in its stead. The journals, the new figures, and the stilled pulse arranged themselves into a single shape that none of them wanted. The rings were not artifacts waiting to be opened like chests. They were organs, customs officers between realms, regulating exchanges of energy and time the way leaf pores govern breath. When rhythms matched, passage occurred, not of bodies but of states, pressure relaxing into motion, cold learning to speak warmth without melting. The old team had guessed a door and met along. The coastline traced in chalk now read like a route for a system that remembered a world wetter and kinder to green. The fractures on the shelf looked less like damage than like stretching before a long swim. If the chamber had accepted their presence at all, it was because they learned to keep time, not because they deserved an answer. The terrifying part was mercy. It had chosen to be gentle, which meant it could have chosen otherwise. The horizon began to carry company. Calls arrived coded as courtesy, then sharpened into directives that smelled of signatures and seals. A treaty plane landed with engines idling like a withheld opinion. Uniforms stepped out in colors designed to look like snow and law at once. They listened and nodded and did not enter the vault. They brought phrases that domesticate fear. Precautionary principle, site stabilization, interim protection. A flag on a crate declared that what lay below belonged to nobody, and therefore to everyone, which meant it would be locked until committees learned a rhythm. They spooled a curtain of silence across channels and asked for cooperation that was not a request. The team surrendered copies and kept their memory. When the last case clicked shut, the air at the borehole cooled. A degree, or perhaps imagination, finished its work. The continent resumed its old face, while papers learned a new vocabulary for not saying what they had seen. They left in staggered lines, as if reluctant to erase their own footprints. Flights stitched them back to latitudes with trees and roofs, and the conspiracy of ordinary clocks. Sleep arrived, but kept a different meter. A softness that began at the center of the chest and radiated outward, an afterimage of the rhythm that had lived under the ice. Everyday noises acquired harmonies. Elevators sighed in 11, traffic lights blinked on a memory, a refrigerator found a patient tempo at night. They did not speak to reporters. They spoke to one another across messages coded as weather and recipes, swapping small phrases to test whether the cadence still recognized their names. In empty rooms, a hush sometimes gathered like a guest who knows the door code. It never overstayed. It simply reminded them of a place that had learned their pattern and then let them go, and of a kindness large enough to frighten. The rhythm returned far from ice, slipping into places that kept their own counsel. A buoy in the gray Atlantic pinged a maintenance server with an extra beat nestled inside its wave reports, a shy syncopation that survived error correction. Another in the Pacific answered 2 days later as if embarrassed to be late. Then a third, off a continental shelf where storms teach iron to rust. The pattern did not shout. It threaded itself into the machinery of monitoring, letting algorithms carry its echo from lighthouse offices to midnight desks, where someone always watches the sea. Most dismissed the anomalies as firmware sulks. A few listened and felt the old gravity settle at the breastbone. The memory of a room that breathed without lungs. The distance between ice and water vanished for the length of a single long thought. Whatever slept beneath the continent had learned escape routes that used patience instead of force. It spoke in tides and technicians, soft enough to be ignored and impossible to forget. Night learned a new trick. Curtains of light wandered where they were not invited. Faint ripples crossing skies from mid-latitudes to equator, with none of the solar tantrums that usually presage shows. At sea, whales altered their lanes as if someone had moved furniture in the deep. A few trawlers reported engines that ran smoother when the idle matched a particular patient tempo. In cities, birds cut diagonals through familiar grids and landed with the collective decisiveness of a single thought. The rhythm that had slept under ice with the dignity of an elder began to pass through air and salt and feather with the courtesy of a guest who tidies as they go. It frightened because it felt kind. Kindness at this scale implied attention vast enough to cradle continents without closing a fist. People who had stood in the vault recognized the feeling first. An invitation to breathe with the world rather than at it, and the risk that such breathing might change everything built on hurry. The last page surrendered days after the world decided nothing dramatic was happening. Moisture and patience coaxed a hidden layer to lift from paper that had traveled too many winters. Under the stain, a sentence waited in a hand steadier than the rest, as if written after the panic had burned away. It did not warn. It confessed. The earlier team had taught the room a rhythm out of loneliness, a campfire beat to ease the cold, and the room had remembered. It had waited for equally careful company and matched them when they arrived, not to trap but to continue a conversation that ice had paused. The realization loosened a knot that fear had tied and tightened another. If the thing beneath the continent learned so easily from contact, then every clumsy knock taught it something too. The choice ahead was not between opening and sealing. It was between speaking well and leaving silence to teach whatever wandered close. A meeting room nowhere famous, filled with jackets, damp from weather, and names that usually live in footnotes. Data spooled across a wall, and with it came the old dilemma that rules prefer. Tell the world and become a story, or speak softly to the few who can carry nuance without sharpening it into weapons. The rhythm on buoys, the skies that rippled, the animals that adjusted lanes, none of it offered threat on a schedule useful for headlines. It offered responsibility, which is harder to sell. The argument bent around a fulcrum few admitted: fear of breaking the spell with clumsy explanation, and fear that silence would invite a noisier guest. In the pause where voices thinned, they chose a third path. Teach the cadence, not the coordinates. Share a way of listening that might keep doors from being kicked in by curiosity dressed as conquest. Send a rumor of patience into the world, and hope it grows teeth, gentle enough to guide. They returned to the edge of the world in different seasons, carrying less gear and more attention. The shaft had glazed over, an old wound politely scarred. No lights waited below, no breath rose warm. Still, the place felt inhabited the way a chapel does before the first footstep. They set nothing on the ice. They stood in a loose circle and matched the count they had learned, not to summon but to say thank you. The wind kept its opinion to itself. Under their boots, the slowest imaginable ascent passed, not a beat so much as a thought that liked the shape of their presence. They did not ask for doors to open. They asked for what they had already been given: the chance to be careful in a world that answers. When they turned away, the horizon looked less like an edge and more like a seam. Somewhere far off, a buoy blinked in a patient rhythm, and the sea, which keeps more secrets than ice, blinked back.